Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the report with me, Yasmin Khatun. On tonight's programme, we'll be looking at agricultural law in Nigeria and what you've been saying about the brutal killing of Lion Cecil in Zimbabwe. But first, a year on from the war in Gaza, Amnesty International says there is strong evidence Israel committed war crimes. Nathaniel Amos Samson has more on this story.
The conflict in Gaza last year has cast a long shadow over international concerns about human rights in the region. Today, a report by Amnesty International says that an Israeli assault in the Gaza Strip, following the capture of one of its soldiers last year, shows strong evidence of war crimes. The London-based rights group, as well as researchers from the organisation Forensic Architecture, called those responsible for the alleged offences to be prosecuted, as it published a detailed analysis of the military operation by Israel.
Militaries used to have something of a monopoly over imagery of war. They have the drones, they have the satellite, they have images on the soldiers, on helmets.
Israel strongly denied the accusations, calling Amnesty's report fundamentally flawed in its methodologies, in its facts, in its legal analysis and its conclusions. The 50-day conflict last summer took a heavy toll on Gaza, killing over 2,000 Palestinians, including more than 500 children, as well as 73 Israelis, 67 of whom were soldiers.
Now joining me to discuss that story on Skype from Jerusalem, Deborah Hyams, from Israel-Palestine researcher at Amnesty International, and on the phone, Nasim Ahmed from Middle East Monitor. Thank you both for joining us. Deborah, can I come to you first? How difficult was it to compile this report?
Thank you very much for having me. It was a year-long process, this investigation, and there were a lot of difficulties. We were working together with Forensic Architecture. We were denied access to the Gaza Strip by the Israeli authorities. So usually the Amnesty International research teams were based in London. We could not get into the Gaza Strip. We put in numerous requests before, during, and after the hostilities. We worked with field workers in the Gaza Strip and were on the phone with them during the conflict, basically hour by hour, and planning out with them where they should go and who they should interview. They worked to collect not just interviews and testimonies, but also pictures and photos, which were then sent to military experts. With Forensic Architecture, we also took information from social media, including videos that were uploaded on the 1st of August, taken by people at the scene, photos, and we also procured satellite imagery. And we've taken all these different pieces of information and put them together to come up with what we think is some of the strongest evidence yet that Israeli forces committed war crimes during the conflict, and in particular in Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip from the 1st to the 4th of August last year.
Deborah, that's what I was going to ask you in terms of particular instances that you can single out that have amounted to what, in your opinion, you've called war crimes. Is there something in particular that may have happened within those few days?
We have a whole series of indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks that we've documented, and we've put by Israeli forces during that time period. We verified at least 135 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces just in Rafah during that period. 75 of them were children. They were the majority were killed on the 1st of August, when after what's known as the Hannibal Directive was invoked by Israeli forces. And what we have, the attacks include attacks on homes, on civilians fleeing under fire, on ambulances very near the main hospital in Rafah. And we've put, it's an online report, so we've put many different cases, not all of them, but many of them online, plus the information about how we and Forensic Architecture did the analysis. I just, maybe to mention one attack in particular, the bombing in the Al-Tanur neighborhood, which we timed to 10:53 a.m. on that day, there was 2 one-ton bombs that were dropped by the Israeli Air Force, and that bombing killed at least 16 Palestinian civilians.
Nasim, can I bring you in now? We have seen reports from Amnesty International that say both sides have committed acts which amount to war crimes. What is your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Deborah for this fantastic report. And because Amnesty is a premier human rights organization, and we don't want its reputation to be tarnished. The reports it publishes, it affects public policy, it gives a moral weight and grounding on various causes, in particular, of course, the Palestinian issue. So since the Gaza war, there's been a string of reports. We had, first of all, the one which came out in November 2014, which looked at the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, families under the rubble. So this was pretty much indicting Israel for attacking civilians in Gaza. And then immediately following that, we had another one which was unlawfully deadly, which was really a way of balancing the criticism, which looked at Hamas rocket attacks and its attack on Israeli citizens. And this seems to be an effort to actually redeem itself and regain some of its credibility, because it came under a lot of accusation of being politically influenced, because the previous report tried to somehow make an equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Although the violence and the levels of devastation was wildly disproportionate. If I could just give some figures here, of the 2,200 Palestinians that were killed, 70% were civilians. And on the Israeli side, of the 73 that were killed, only 8%, which is only 1, was civilian. So even though we had such disproportionate levels of aggression from the Israeli side, there was a sense that Amnesty, with all its weight of reputation, was using its influence to make false equivalences, show that Hamas's atrocities and Israeli atrocities could be connected, and they were more or less the same. So it was a false narrative which somehow Amnesty fell into, and this report somehow, I think, it redeemed some of its reputation as a premier human rights organization which is defending the cause of Palestinians and other impoverished and oppressed people around the world.
Deborah, do you want to come back on that? We have actually just seen some footage of some of the wide-scale devastation that was caused and inflicted upon the Gaza Strip. Nasim there mentioning the level of devastation and how they were incomparable. Do you want to come back on some of what he just said?
Sure. I mean, I think, first of all, the idea that this is a report that we published yesterday, which we've literally been working on this investigation for a year since, the attacks were committed. So the idea that we just somehow pulled it together, in the last few weeks to somehow redeem our reputation is completely false. I mean, we view it's a body of work that we've published on the war last year, on the actions by both sides, and we stand by that body of work, which, by the way, is much more extensive than the 2 reports that Nasim mentioned. It includes other reports also on illegal attacks by Israeli forces, including on multi-story buildings, on targeting medics. And if you really look at the reports that we put out, the statements, the press releases, the other things that we put out during the hostilities, as the information was coming in, I don't think that you can actually have, this idea that we're somehow going from one thing to the other and trying to draw, false equivalencies. It's simply wrong. And on the 1st of August last year, in fact, we called for ICC jurisdiction over the situation in Palestine in order for the court to be able to investigate war crimes. So this idea that we're somehow coming at this late is just wrong. Now, in terms of what happened on the ground during the war and our analysis, Nasim is absolutely right. The vast majority of those killed were Palestinians. The devastation in Gaza was immense. The majority of the people killed in the Gaza Strip were civilians. We've said clearly straight through that, the Israeli attacks were unlawful, that there should be, specific attacks should be investigated as war crimes, and that the policies of the Israeli authorities bombing family homes systematically across the Gaza Strip, for example, should be investigated independently and impartially. And we've also said consistently that the Israeli authorities are not doing that. That the military investigations conducted by the Israeli authorities are not independent, are not credible, are not genuine.
Deborah, before we do have to move on, what impact do you think this report will have?
Well, like I said, when we called initially for the ICC to be given jurisdiction, and we've been calling, by the way, on the Palestinian authorities to ratify the Rome Statute and issue a declaration. We've been making that call for years. We've had a whole campaign calling on President Abbas to do that. He finally did it on the 31st of December 2014, following campaigning by Amnesty International, other international human rights organizations, and a lot of local Palestinian organizations that we were supporting. So now there's a different situation legally. There is a preliminary examination that the Office of the Prosecutor has opened, and we hope that the body of work on reports that we've put out will be very carefully considered by the Office of the Prosecutor. And we hope that the Office of the Prosecutor will recognize that not only have these war crimes been committed, but that, to date, the Israeli authorities have failed to conduct credible, independent investigations. And we believe that there's a very clear role for international justice mechanisms here, including the ICC. And I have to say also one more point, which is that, yes, we do believe that Palestinian armed groups also committed war crimes during the conflict. And, the report that Nasim was referring to wasn't drawing a false equivalency, but it was saying that the armed groups should not have fired weapons that cannot be aimed at military targets.
Thank you, Deborah. Let me bring Nasim back in. Nasim, we've already heard a response from the Israelis. What sort of response are we going to receive? Will the report have the impact that we hope it might?
Well, I think it kind of sets the record straight, but I think there is an underlying problem with a lot of these human rights reports that come out, whether it be from Amnesty or the United Nations. There is, as I said, a sense of trying to equate the violence of the two. I mean, surely we should hold the countries of democratic countries like Israel to much higher standards to political organizations like Hamas, certainly one which is described by Israel in the international community as a terrorist organization. So this idea of somehow creating an equivalence between the violence committed by a so-called democratic country, Israel, and a so-called terrorist organization, Hamas, to me seems extremely ludicrous. I mean, Israel is supposed to be, as a recognized state, supposed to be upholding humanitarian law, international law, and Hamas as an organization is seen as a terrorist organization. So I don't see why we, or the international community and human rights organizations, need to bend over backwards to somehow make equivalences in terms of Hamas's war crimes and Israeli war crimes. War crimes committed by Israel is far more indictable in the sense because it's a recognized state, so-called democratic state.
I don't think Amnesty was saying they equate to the same, but that rather both parties had committed wrongs on their parts. We are going to have to leave that topic there for now. We have run out of time, but we're going to go for a short break now. After that, we'll come back and take a look at the rest of the day's news and what you've been saying on Twitter. Join us after the break.